doing this as a part of my capstone project. I was in the President's Leadership Institute last year, and all of us did a capstone project that is basically highlighting some particular area that we were very passionate about that could give, that could kind of help some of our students be successful. And so my area of passion is with mental health. And so I've been designing this series. We've had a 3-part series. Today is our last session. And we are going to be, I know, hearing from someone who is very, very good at what he does. So I'm not going to talk long, but I'm just going to introduce him really quick to everybody. I mentioned here in the group earlier that I know Dr. Holler from his graduate student days, and now he's Dr. Holler. So before he was even Dr. Holler, but when I worked at Dozier School for Boys, Dr. Holler was a grad student there. He's one of our, he was in his PhD program, and he was working with us at the program. He is now, of course, as you can see, he has many accolades. He is the Assistant Dean at the College of Nursing and Health Sciences, and he's also the Psychology Department Chair, yes, at Bethune-Cookman University. Don't hold that against him because we are in Tallahassee. But that's okay, right? He's still a Seminole because he graduated from Florida State University. In addition to that, he has done many talks and workshops, and his area of specialization is with suicide risk, and he can talk about, of course, all of those things. You can see some of these on the board. He does have his own business. I want to say this is with you and your wife, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so him and his wife owns Danninger Solutions Incorporated, a little bit of their research consulting firm. You can, of course, look up some information about that. And of course, he can tell you about anything he wants to tell you about that as well. So I'm going to get out of the way. Again, if you are needing snacks, drinks, or water, there in the back. Also, if before you leave, even if you have to leave out early, please make sure you visit the table in the back as well. There's some information on some mental health resources. Dr. Michelle Mitchell was here last month. She provided some of her magazines there in the back as well. So copies of that are in the back as well. So please get a copy of those and take with you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Holler.
All right. Thank you for that, Ms. Baker. All right, can you all hear me okay? Just give me like a thumbs up on the screen. Thank you, appreciate it. Okay, so just to recap really quickly. So my name is Daniel Holler. I have a PhD in clinical psychology from Florida State University. My area of expertise is suicide risk assessment. So I work with the preeminent psychologist, the researcher, Dr. Thomas Joyner at Florida State University. He is world renowned for his work on suicide risk assessment. So one of the things that I wanted to do was look at suicide in the Black community. So when I was in graduate school at Florida State, like Ms. Baker said, I studied suicide risk among African Americans. People would always ask me and say things like, hey, you know, Black people don't die by suicide. Why are you studying suicide? This was back in maybe 2003. And, you know, for me at the time, it was just a means to an end. To get my degree, I had to take a research interest with the person I was working with. So you have to put in the work to get what you want, where you want to go. So I looked at suicide in the Black community. And as I began researching it, I started to realize that it is an issue in the Black community, especially among young Black men. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. But that's how I got my interest in suicide risk assessment. That led to, you know, after I graduated, continued doing research. That led to me doing work on suicide among law enforcement personnel. So I look at suicide among police officers. They have one of the highest rates of suicide in the nation as far as professions go. And that has a lot to do with their exposure to pain, trauma, and violence, which I'll talk about how that also relates to the Black community. Some other things like Ms. Baker said, I do have a psychoeducational financial literacy consulting firm called Daninger Solutions that I run with my wife. Some notable things that we've done a 2-day training for Chicago PD, which is the second largest police department in the nation. They have like over 5,000 officers. We did a 2-day training there on mental wealth. So talking about how your mental well-being affects your job performance and also how your finances impact your ability to think clearly at work, because those are issues that officers tend to face. We also did some training for law enforcement in Cook County up in Chicago, for correctional officers, for personnel who work in law enforcement, looking at the role of trauma, looking at suicide, and looking at general mental health of officers. Okay. And so today, though, what I want to talk about is how all these things, trauma and violence, affect African Americans. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the history of trauma and violence that we've experienced as individuals of African descent, African Americans, or Black people. I'll probably use both terms interchangeably. And I'll talk about how trauma and violence play a major role in our mental well-being. And this is something that's often not discussed in our community because of the stigma associated with mental illness and mental health. I'll talk some about those stigmas and how we can overcome them. So, Black mental health matters, right? So any part of the brain, any part of the body can get sick. Just like you can get heart disease, you can get cancer of your organs, kidney disease, whatever. Any organ in the body can become sick. The brain is an organ and the brain can become ill as well. When the brain becomes ill, we call that a mental illness. Okay, so without mental health, we cannot be healthy. Mental health conditions are medical conditions that can alter your life because they make it hard to relate to others and function. And so without proper treatment, the conditions will worsen. So we can see how we're suffering from some mental health issues, and when we don't get treatment, it's not going to just go away. It's going to get worse over time and cause further impairment. For today, what we're going to look at are 6 different areas I have. We're going to talk about the concept of Ma'afa and what that means and how it relates to the Black American experience. Okay. We'll talk about the incidence of and prevalence of violence and trauma and abuse in the Black community. We'll talk about the effects of that violence and trauma on our mental well-being. I'll be discussing another area of research of mine, which is acculturation and psychopathology, looking at how, as individuals of African descent, as we're exposed to the larger popular culture, the dominant society's cultural value system, when we adopt those value systems, we may become at risk for pathology that we don't normally find in our community. Then we'll discuss and review culturally centered treatment applications, and we'll wrap up with recommendations and some clinical strategies to reduce risk. So some terms that are going to be important when we're talking about the Ma'afa. So violence, when we talk about violence, violence means any type of physical injury or harm done to another person. Trauma is the body's response to that violence. It's how you react to having been exposed to trauma and violence. You will become hyper vigilant, anxious, fidgety, and it impairs your ability to think and reason optimally. Stress refers to the pressures that individuals feel as they try to solve the daily problems in their life. Acculturative stress, I mentioned earlier, that is the stress we feel as members of a minority group as we try to adhere to our own cultural value system and integrate into the large dominant society. And we feel this push and pull of which values do I keep from my community and will let go, and which ones in the dominant society do I acculturate or adopt. And then suicide, when we talk about suicide, we're going to be talking about any act in which a person tries to take their own life. Okay. So what is the Ma'afa and what is this, how does this play? The Maafa refers to a Kiswahili term for terrible occurrence or great disaster. It's also known as the African Holocaust. So we've all heard about the Jewish Holocaust in World War II in Nazi Germany. Well, before that, there was something called the African Holocaust. It didn't have that exact name, but it was very similar in what happened, which is the extermination of a group of people. So millions of Africans died during the Middle Passage or transatlantic slave trade. This is what we refer to as the Maafa. According to Clark, 1992, it is our Holocaust because this is a Holocaust that started 400 years ago and it is not over. So what are they talking about? 400 years ago, this Holocaust started. Well, in August of 1619, the first documented Africans arrived in the English colony of Virginia. The group reported upon arrival was 20 and odd Negroes and was part of a larger group of West Africans enslaved by the Portuguese slave traders. So in case you didn't know, back in 2019, Congress actually celebrated 400 years of African-American history, which is talking about African-Americans having been in the Western world since 1619 to 2019. That is the actual 400-year mark that we have been here in the West under systems of slavery and oppression that still go on today. So you can look that up. Congress actually did a report about it to commemorate the 400-year mark of African Americans in the West. This was also commemorated in Ghana. Ghana is a country in West Africa where a lot of Black American ancestors came from. I actually had the privilege of going to Ghana for about 2 weeks. That was one of the best experiences of my life. I was able to go with my professor, Dr. Naim Akbar, and a group of other students from throughout the country. And as you can see here, a lot of celebrities that you may recognize took advantage of this year return in 2019. You have Danny Glover, Ludacris, Steve Harvey, Michael Jai White, who have returned to Africa to help commemorate this occasion. So why is that important? Well, during the Maafa, there was a lot of pain, trauma, and violence inflicted upon Black people, right? And after being in the country for 400 years, when the emancipation occurred and Blacks were supposedly set free, right? There was never any treatment for mental health issues. It was just that there was a document signed that said, you all are now free, go about your business. But there was no consideration for the impact of the many years of violence that this group of people have been exposed to and subjugated with. And as we know today, inflicting pain, trauma, and violence on people affects their mental well-being. So if you have people who were oppressed for hundreds of years, exposed to pain, trauma, and violence, they're supposedly set free, and now they have to learn how to survive in a society in an optimal way. And so in order to do that, they had to adopt certain cultural practices and behaviors that were adaptive at the time, but may not be adaptive today, but are still being practiced. According to Dr. Bobby Wright, menticide is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a person's or group's mind, which may give a clue to why the Black race, after developing such an advanced civilization, we talk about Timbuktu, we talk about Nubia, ancient Kemet, or Egypt. So how did we develop these advanced civilizations, but for the last 400 years, been assisting in our own destruction and nearly total subjugation of Africa by foreign invaders? So how are we assisting in our own destruction? Well, you see it in the media all the time. They talk about Black violence. They talk about the violence in Chicago in particular, a lot of gun violence that occurs in our community. And so menticide is a term that helps us understand, what happened to the group of people, Black Americans, after the Maafa, and how it is that that trauma has impacted us. According to Dr. Larry Richardson, Dr. Richardson is a mentor of mine. He's also a graduate from Florida A&M University, and he worked as the psychologist for the Jacksonville Jaguars for a number of years. He's now retired, but he talks about behavior being largely determined by our culture, and there's kind of a continuum along which we exist, right? So you have authentic behavior. Authentic behavior is consistent with a consistent and predictable form of cultural substance of the people. Right, so this would be having like an African-centered worldview. This would be the optimal behavioral pattern for individuals of African descent. And what do I mean by African-centered worldview? That's when you look at the world and problems and solutions from your vested interest of your ethnic and racial group. Okay, so when you study things in class, you learn European history, you learn world history, but you look at how does it apply to me specifically as an individual and as an individual of African descent. Okay, so you look at the world and its problems through your own cultural lens and perspective to come up with solutions. Then we have an adapted behavior. Adapted behavior is consistent with the culture and has been modified in response to the environment. So what we're talking about here would be similar to acculturation. So this is a suboptimal way of being. This is when an individual holds on to their own cultural beliefs and value system, but also modifies or adapts their cultural value system based on the environment that they're in. And so they may adopt certain values and behaviors from the larger society. We call that acculturation. Adopted behavior is adopted behaviors are uncritically borrowed from another culture. This is what we refer to as assimilation. This is when you just look at the dominant society and say, hey, whatever they do is right, I'm not even going to criticize or question it. If it's relevant to me as a person, a Black person, an individual, but I'm just going to do what everybody else is doing because that's what the dominant society is doing. That's called assimilation. Those types of behaviors are problematic because in a society that's founded on racism and white supremacy, remember we talked about the Mahaffa and slavery, this happened before the United States was formed, slavery was here, and the United States was born out of slavery. So if you assimilate the cultural values of the dominant society that is founded on slavery and the subjugation of Black people, you will assimilate certain values and beliefs about Black people that are detrimental or maladaptive to your well-being. This could lead to feelings of self-hate, or where you feel that Black people are lesser than others. And then we have aberrant behavior. This is antithetical to the culture, it's opposite or against Black culture, right? And if not corrected, will result in a distortion and or destruction of the individual and their group. And so this is what we might refer to as cultural misorientation. Okay. And it's self-destructive. Cultural misorientation is when, as an individual of African descent, you have totally assimilated the dominant society's values and belief system, and you practice behaviors which are detrimental to you as a Black person. So we might see some people in popular culture and media, and we see them do things that seem antithetical to being Black. So easy one, Kanye West. Right, he wore this White Lives Matter shirt and kind of caused an uproar for some people, mostly for Black people, because in the Black community, it's already understood that White Lives Matter. But what's not understood in the Black community, at least how the Black community feels, the larger society doesn't value Black life. And so that's part of this Black Lives Matter movement to bring attention that Black life matters too. But when someone wears, a shirt that is against the culture, now they may have different reasons for why they did it, different nuances for what they were doing. They're trying to market something, the government's an idea, they wanted to make money, whatever the case is, it's antithetical or it's self-destructive to the community that person belongs to. Okay, so we refer to that as cultural misorientation or aberrant behavior. And so we all fall somewhere on these in this continuum. Most of us fall somewhere between 2 and 3. Right? I think I'm probably in the adaptive behavior component, and I strive for an African-centered worldview, for optimal way of being. Now, so we're talking about the Mahaffa, the pain and violence inflicted upon Black people when they came to this country, and the fact that after emancipation, there was never any care or concern given, no reparation for the harm inflicted upon the people, no material reparation, so forth, social, right? That has been long lasting. Not only that, there were certain behaviors that we practiced, or that our ancestors practiced, that was adapted at the time, because they needed to do these things to survive. So certain ways of eating, ways of dressing, and probably most easy to look at as food, what we were eating, right? So when we look at the diet of enslaved Africans, you know, they ate portions of food that was given to them that was the food that was rejected from the owners of the plantation. So they got the scraps, whatever was left over, whatever was the suboptimal food that was left over that they could take. They would season it up because it's stuff that wouldn't necessarily taste good, like party by fennel, like chitlins, right? Test it out. This is not something that people were eating who were in the land of abundance, you know, in the motherland. Right? This is something that people were eating as triage just to survive. People who were being oppressed, physically and mentally. Well, over time, that adopted culture, that adopted practice became part of the culture. And so people might say, oh, soul food is black culture. But we have to think about, well, were they eating the soul food before we came here? And if we weren't, it's the result of slavery, and it's actually a slave culture that we still practice. So what am I talking about? Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome. In short, she's talking about there are certain behaviors that came out of the transatlantic slave trade that we had to practice in order to survive. And after we were set free, we still were practicing these suboptimal behaviors. And we pass those behaviors down to our children throughout time, to the point where no one knows why we do those behaviors. We think it's part of our culture, but it may actually be detrimental to us today. So post-traumatic slavery syndrome is a set of behaviors, beliefs, and actions related to multi-generational trauma, as well as an undiagnosed and untreated post-traumatic stress disorder in enslaved Africans and their descendants. That's us. Slavery followed by systemic and structural racism and oppression have resulted in multi-generational maladaptive behaviors, which originated as survival strategies, things that we had to eat and do to survive. Post-traumatic slavery syndrome, according to Dr. Joy DeGruy, continues because children are often indoctrinated by parents and society into the same maladaptive behaviors long after the behaviors have lost their contextual effectiveness. So if you remember social learning theory, Albert Bandura talks about social learning theory, where you can put a kid in the room with a bowling ball that you hit and bounce it back up. If you just put the kid in the room with the doll, and it's a novel situation for the child, you're not going to hit the bowling ball and they play around with it, or you just ignore it. But if someone sees someone, or she sees someone punch that bowling ball, the kid learns the behavior that I can hit this thing, that's the appropriate behavior to do. That's all, in short, social learning theory. And so what Dr. Joy DeGruy is saying is that there are behaviors that we learned and that have been passed down to us by what we observed and saw that we continue today, but we don't necessarily understand the ideology or the root of that behavior. For example, one example that Dr. DeGruy gives, she talks about Thanksgiving. It's Thanksgiving dinner, and there's a mother, she's cooking Thanksgiving dinner, she's cooking pot. And what the mother does, the little daughter is watching her mother cook the pot roast, and she sees the mother cut a quarter off one of the pot roast, quarter off back of it, put it in the pan, put it in the oven, cook it. So the daughter asks the mother, Mom, why did you cut a quarter off the front, a quarter off the end of the pot roast? She says, I don't know, that's how my mom did it. I'm doing what my mom used to do. So she said, go ask your grandmother. So the little girl goes to her grandmother and asks her grandmother, why did you cut, quarter off the front, quarter off the end of the pot roast? And she says, well, I don't know, that's what my mother did. Go ask your great grandmother. The little girl was fortunate enough to have her great grandmother around. So she asked her great grandmother, why did you cut a quarter off the front end and the back of the pot roast? And the great grandmother says, well, when I was young, we were very poor, and we didn't have a pan big enough to fit the entire roast. So we had to cut it down smaller we made sandwiches out of the pieces that we cut off, but we had to cut it, but it in the pot. We only had one pot to bake it. And she said, oh, okay. And so what's going on is, no one has asked what the root of this behavior was, but to find out that this is something that came out of being impoverished, and the family did to adapt and survive. And this behavior has been passed down through generations to the point where it become part of the family's culture, where they're now affluent, they got their mom, their great grandmother all together, their little daughter at home, even Thanksgiving dinner, practicing behaviors from when they used to, when the family used to be impoverished. Okay, so this is what we mean by social learning theory and how we are still practicing certain behaviors that have come out of the slave trade and the slavery experience in the United States. Post-traumatic slave syndrome cannot solely be treated and remedied clinically. It requires profound social change in individuals and institutions. And so that is talking about not only do we have to treat the individual, but we have to look at our society, because there are certain structures in society that breed pathology, one of which is systemic racism. Now, so we talked a little bit about the Mahafla and the pain, trauma, and violence that was inflicted upon Black people. We talked about social learning theory and how there were some adaptive behaviors in the past that were taught and perpetuated through history that may be maladapted today, that people think are part of our culture and may actually not be. There's also a factor for violence in our community that impacts our mental well-being. And so Dr. Larry Richardson, this comes from his work, where he looks a lot about trauma among individuals of African descent, in particular our youth. So as a side note, this is pain, trauma, and violence is not something indicative to Black people. It is something indicative to poverty. So when we look around the world and we find impoverished environments, we find high rates of violence. And in the United States, Black people are more likely to be impoverished than other groups, and therefore they experience a lot of violence in their communities, right? In impoverished communities. And so when I was a graduate TA at Florida State, and I taught, classes of 100 students in it, mostly white, probably like only a handful of Black kids. They would come to my office, we would talk about their grades and things like that, or they were sick, they had to be out, or the doctor's note, whatever the case. When I started teaching at an HBCU, a historically Black college, at Cookman, my students would come to me and say, there was a shootout over the weekend, and I almost got shot. Or my student right before graduation did get shot. Luckily, it was in her butt, she was still going to graduation. But I had never heard of these things happening in college. That college students are experiencing gun violence on a regular basis. At least once a year, we will hear about some student involved in a situation. That was very foreign to me, coming from a predominantly white institution. I never even thought about college students undergoing that type of behavior on a regular basis. So violence is the #1 killer of Black children between the ages of 15 to 24. Yep, let that soak in for a second. Racism, social isolation, drug and alcohol abuse, and media violence contribute to violent behavior. So what we see in social media contributes to violent behavior. Okay, drugs and alcohol contribute to violent behavior. Racism, experiencing racism contributes to violent behavior. African American youth suffer from Black self-hatred due to conditioning from their social environment. Okay, so conditioning from their social environment. So what that means is it's talking about the images that you see of Black people and Black youth in particular. Okay, it's very rare that you're going to be able to find a positive image of Black people in the media. Mostly what you find are stereotypical images. You find the Black group, the big buff, strong Black guy, maybe an athlete or something to that effect, or it's not too bright. That's the image they portray. Or you see a criminal, right? Someone who's like a thug or a gangster or something hood like that. Kind of like I see a lot of rappers, the images that they portray, even though those are facades for many of them. So you see these images
And because
Because the social learning theory, what you're doing is you're modeling appropriate behavior for Black youth.
And those are the only things they see, and that's what they think they're supposed to do.
Right, and they'll perpetuate those behaviors.
So
think about that and how watching images of yourself as being a violent person, through social learning theory, you learn violence as a solution to the problem. And the images coming from the media that are negative about Black people, thinking about the history of slavery and the general zeitgeist of Black Americans in this country, and how there's a lot of negative stereotypes about our community. And those things, if you assimilate those values and these experiences, and you don't think critically about what you're seeing and what you're getting exposed to, it can lead you to not like yourself. Right? So what does that look like? Well, it's not saying I would marry and hate myself, but I just hate other Black people. You talk bad about other Black people, you don't say anything positive about them. Sometimes it looks like someone who maybe on the soapbox and they're putting their finger and saying, oh, Black people will never get together because they're always fighting each other. Or Black people will never have any money because we never work well together. We buy frivolous things. We're wasteful. And so those people who are out there thinking that they're trying to say something positive are actually perpetuating this negative stereotype about Black people. Because they don't know all Black people say that. Right? That's just Black people that they know. They have experience. But when you perpetuate those negative stereotypes and beliefs about us, it shows that you have a form of self-hatred towards your own people. And if you get deeper, you'll see that there's some that exists towards yourself. And you might engage in maladaptive or self-destructive behaviors like drugs and alcohol. Or be prone to take risks and engage in violence, especially towards people that look like you. If you have self-hatred, you're more likely to attack those people who look like you than someone who doesn't. So victimization levels increase as youth get older. So youth ages 12 to 24 suffer more violent crimes than any other age group. Over the lifetime, 71% of 14 to 17-year-olds suffer from assault, 28% suffer sexual victimization, 32% abuse or neglect, 53% property victimization. Black youth are 3 times more likely to be victims of reported child abuse or neglect. So there's a lot of violence that goes on in our community that our children experience. They witness violence, they experience the violence personally, or they hear about it. And now we consume it in social media. People share videos of violence on World Star, things like that. Black youth are 3 times more likely to be victims of robbery, 5 times more likely to be victims of homicide. Living in an urban environment increases the risk of exposure to violence. 25% have witnessed a murder. 25% of Black youth living in urban environments, 1 in 4 have witnessed a murder. So that was something that was astonishing to me. But it definitely is believable from my own personal experience working at an HBCU with Black students. It reminds me of there's a movie called Boys in the Hood. I don't know if you've all seen this movie. The movie starts out where the kids are walking in South Central LA, and one of the little kids is like, "Hey, you want to see a dead body?" I remember I was probably like 12 or 13, and I came out, I was like, "That's not real."
Yeah, right.
I've never been outside with kids talking about like, see a dead body. The data said that that's a real experience. So, a study of 7-year-olds found that 75% heard gunshots, 60% saw drug deals, 18% saw a dead body outside. 10% witnessed a stabbing at home. So domestic violence issues are high in our community. What is the role of racism in all of this? Does racism affect our mental well-being? Well, racism is a type of violence. It's a type of social violence. You're inflicting harm on others. Remember, we said violence is when you're inflicting harm on other people. According to the University of California, they did a study that's published in the Journal of Pediatrics. They said that discrimination makes you more likely to develop mental and behavioral problems. So discrimination like racism. Medical records, so they reviewed medical records of 1,800 Americans ages 18 to 28, They cited race as a common factor for discrimination. So they believe they were being discriminated against because they were Black. That's the shorthand version of that statement. Frequent discrimination. So those people who experience frequent discrimination were 25% more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness. So people who experience racism like 2 to 3 times a week, they're reporting this. They're also 2 times as likely to develop severe psychological distress. People of color, that term they use to describe us and other minority groups. So if you're a person of color, you're more likely to be exposed to negative socioeconomic factors such as poverty, you mentioned that earlier, unemployment, incarceration, we know about mass incarceration of Black men and women, and you're also more likely to be exposed to abuse. African American adults are 20% more likely to report serious psychological distress than white adults. And Native or Indigenous Americans have the highest reported rate of mental illnesses. They often go untalked about because it's such a small percentage of the population today, but they have the highest suicide rates, they have some of the highest alcohol abuse rates, and some of the highest general mental illness rates. Racism causes Black Americans' brains to age faster than people of other races, increasing the risk of dementia. So this just came out in the Journal of American Medical Association Neurology in 2022. Earlier, yes, it was still in November, so earlier this month this came out. Racism puts you at risk of developing cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's. So again, racism is violent, it causes injury to individuals. So in general, so what are the effects of all of this? The effects of violence, trauma, and racism on Black mental health, in particular in suicide, right? That's my area. So how do mental health conditions affect the African American community? These are some common mental health problems that are experienced in our community. Major depression. That's because it's the most common mental illness in the world. So that's also going to be the most common that you'll find in Black people. Then we also have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? ADHD. That's high in Black children, and it may be because it's overdiagnosed in Black children. Post-traumatic stress disorder is high in our community. Why? Because we are more likely to be victims of violent crime. If you live in an impoverished area, there's going to be high rates of violence in your community. If you are exposed to pain, trauma, and violence, you can develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And suicide. Suicide is high among young African American men. So when I was in grad school doing this research, there was a stat that was about, over the last 10 years, suicide had risen 233% in the Black community among young Black men, ages 15 to 24. So these are our youth are killing themselves. So how exactly prevalent is suicide among our youth? Well, this is a study, another study in the Journal of American Medical Association that states temporal trends in suicide ideation and attempts among adolescents in the United States show that while suicide rates or suicide ideation and anxiety have risen sharply during the pandemic, a new study finds that suicide attempts, particularly among adolescents, have been rising at an alarming rate even before COVID-19. So what do we have here? Here's a chart from their study. And this chart here, A, looking at suicide ideation, and this one is looking at attempt. So people who actually attempted, these are just people who think about attempting but haven't. Okay. And so what we find here, and take a second to look at this chart, you can see that we have, this is American Indian, Alaskan Native. They're the only group that has had a steady increase in suicide ideation, even when other groups were decreasing, going down in suicide ideation. We also see here, this might be interesting to us, this is African Americans, this orange line, that African Americans ideation since about 2005 has been on a steady increase. When we look at attempts, we see again, Native Americans, their attempts have actually gone down. So even though their ideation is going up, attempts have gone down.
And for most people, attempts are going down. For most ethnic groups, we have white, Asian Islanders, Asian Islanders, and Hispanic all the way down. Right? And
So this is thought of because maybe there are resources being poured into
these communities to address this issue. Suicide ideation is the top from attempt. But for African Americans, what do we see? It's the only one that has increased. So
whatever's going on, African Americans are not getting the benefits to help reduce their risk of suicide attempt. So teenagers, according to the study, teenagers were attempting suicide, and it increased by 22%. The trend varied depending on sex and race. There were more white women attempting suicide from 2009 to 2019, which is, you know, kind of what we expect to see in the literature because white women have higher suicide
ideation and attempts, but not deaths.
White men tend to have more deaths by suicide because they use more lethal means. Suicide ideation also increased for white, Black, and Hispanic women. Okay. Black males had the highest increase in suicide attempts, increasing nearly 80%. So why are people dying by suicide?
Well, this is my major professor, I told you about Dr. Thomas Joyner. He wrote a book called Why People Die by Suicide. This is his life's work. He studies suicide. His father died by suicide. He was actually studying it before this occurred, but this has, you know, helped to be a catalyst for him to keep his fire burning and trying to find a solution to this problem.
So according to Joyner's theory of suicide,
and I'm going to talk about how it relates to Black people specifically, but this theory is for everyone in general. It talks about three major components: there's thwarted belongingness, perceived murderousness, and the acquired capability for suicide. And so thwarted belongingness is feelings of being alone. Okay. Perceived murderousness is feeling like you're ineffective, that you're weighing other people down, that they'd be better off without you. Okay, if you have these two, thwarted belongingness and perceived murderousness, you have a high risk of having a desire for suicide or suicide ideation. Right? These are people who want to die. They feel alone, they feel like they're worthless. Well, those people may feel like they want to die, and they may actually attempt. But the ones who actually die by suicide, right, who have lethal means, are these unique groups of people right here that have this acquired capability, which is that they're not afraid to die by suicide. They're not afraid to inflict self-injury. The way you get to this point, because it's in your human nature to want to survive. You hear a loud noise, bang, a gunshot, you're gonna duck or run, right? Because it's hardwired into you to want to survive and to stay alive. But these people, they don't have that anymore. They're not afraid to inflict self-injury or attempt suicide. And this happens because of repeated exposure to pain, trauma, and violence. That's how you acquire the ability to self-injure.
So let's look at Dr. Joyner explain this a little bit, if we can get it up.
Now joining us at this point is Dr. Thomas.
I can't remember if we turned the, did we turn the volume down on the?
Yes, I turned my audio down.
Now joining us at this point is Dr. Thomas Joyner, a distinguished research professor in the Department of Psychology at Florida State University. Now he's written a book called Why People Die by Suicide.
Can you all hear the video or no?
Picture of it up. Why People Die by Suicide. It's not a beach read, I understand, but it is an important message.
Anyone in the chat?
Dr. Rogers says yes.
Okay.
I can't hear it. This Ms.
It
Hardy.
shouldn't have been on.
Let me see.
I used it earlier in class. So, yeah, down there. Yeah. That's
Sorry about that. I'm going to start this over. We couldn't hear it here in the room.
Now joining us at this point is Dr. Thomas Joyner, a distinguished research professor in the Department of Psychology at Florida State University. Now, he's written a book called Why People Die by Suicide.
Oops. Sorry about that. Touch anything, it's gonna.
Now joining us at this point is Dr. Thomas Joyner, a distinguished research professor in the Department of Psychology at Florida State University. Now, he's written a book called Why People Die by Suicide. Let me say that again, and there's a picture of it up. Why People Die by Suicide. It's not a beach read, I understand, but it is an important message. Now, sadly, Dr. Joyner's own father committed suicide 18 years ago. Now, this really moved you to try to figure out how somebody with such a great and productive mind could get in such a dark place as to end their life.
That's right. My dad's death makes me feel honor bound to not only understand it, but to exact some revenge for it. Something or somebody stole my dad away from me is the way I view it. And so I feel honor bound to return that favor and exact revenge. Here it's going to be exacting revenge on suicide itself by studying it scientifically, by advocacy, and through clinical and prevention work.
Yeah, and so by helping people understand it, know the warning signs, see what's going on, then we're raising awareness just by having this conversation.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what these wonderful people are doing down here, because at this point you say that Casey really wanted to make a difference in this world, and you can't just now sit back and not do something given the experience, true?
Yeah, exactly. I had a lot of the same pain that I think Mr. and Mrs. Brooks expressed, and that pain was strong for a while, but it did lessen. And then after it did, I poured my professional energies into trying to combat this international killer.
And you've made some headway. You figured something out. Dr. Joyner believes that people considering suicide share three traits in a very common way. And the first one is feeling like a burden on other people, and that their death will be worth more than their life. Talk about that.
That's right. It's the idea, the mental calculation that my death will be worth more than my life. If you truly believe that, you could see how that would facilitate suicidal behavior. And we've shown in multiple studies that it does indeed do that. Crucially, the person is mistaken in that perception. But the trick is that they don't know that they're mistaken in that perception. They believe it to be true, and it spurs suicidal behavior.
And isn't it true that most suicidal situations and dilemmas that push people over the edge are transient? That if they had just stuck it out, they tend to get better?
Absolutely. There's no question about that. And there's also no question, as you've already alluded to, that there are good, effective treatments that work for the conditions that underlie suicidal behavior.
Yeah. Psychologically, therapeutically, pharmacologically, there are so many things that can give people relief.
Absolutely.
The second common trait that Dr. Joyner talks about is a feeling of loneliness or social disconnection.
If you look through the literature, the scientific literature on suicidal behavior, arguably the single most powerful risk factor of all is loneliness, a feeling of alienation from others.
Yeah, so they just don't feel like they fit, belong, so they're just on the outside looking in, so why not just leave?
That's right.
All right, and the third thing is an interesting thing that he talks about called fearlessness regarding pain, injury, and death. People considering suicide have learned to overcome these natural fears, and you say that that's more common than cowardice or that sort of thing.
That's right. I think it's a common misunderstanding to think of people who have died by suicide as cowardly or weak. That's just not accurate. And indeed, to do something as fearsome and as daunting as death by suicide, you do require a kind of fearlessness in order to carry through.
Yeah. When we come back.
Okay, so hopefully.
As you were listening to Dr. Joyner, because we're talking about Black mental health, you were thinking with an African-centered worldview of how does this apply to me as a Black person? What does it look like in my community? So you talk about thwarted belongings.
African American youth are treated or viewed as stronger and older, but don't have people to talk to about their vulnerability.
African American youth are discriminated against in school and can often be perceived as older than they are. These are some of the factors that African American youth may experience that leads to feelings of poor belonging and not fitting in. I had a client who was a 13-year-old girl. Her parents wanted to talk to me about some discrimination she was experiencing. She was a military kid. She's one of the only black girls at her school, and students on the bus were talking about how black people haven't contributed anything to the country. It's only been white people and Asian people, right? And she kept experiencing these microaggressions and overt aggressions of racial antagonism. Well, when she reported it, what happened was she was writing an email at school, and she talked about suicide. She wanted to die because she was being treated. You know, schools, you're writing emails, they can scan your emails and just trigger a warning. They called her into the guidance office, asked her what was going on. She told them, well, these kids are being racist to me, and this is why she felt that way. And so what the school counselor told her was, are you sure that they're being racist to you? Are you sure that that's what's going on? Are you sure it's not just you, you're being sensitive?
Okay. So these are experiences that Black people go through anecdotally, right? Where they feel like they don't belong or they don't fit in, and they're not supported when they talk about these issues of racial discrimination. Perceived burdensomeness
in the Black community might look like African American youth who are being
faced with financial hardships, among other stressors, and may have untreated mental health needs, stigma associated with mental illness. The growing risk to mental well-being of systemic racism, discrimination, and socioeconomic disparities need to be better studied and addressed by psychological and social scientists.
As we looked at earlier, we showed how racism affects your mental health and well-being.
Well,
Also, if you ascribe and assimilate Western European values about Black people, you may start to feel ineffective and worthless, or like your community is ineffective and worthless. Remember, I talked to you about people saying, oh, Black people will never come together, they'll never amass any wealth, they can't be unified, there's all this black on black violence, etc.
right, those things, if you ascribe to those values,
that will make you feel like you
are ineffective, that people will be better off without you, that you don't contribute to society.
Remember, I told you, they told the little girl, Black people haven't contributed to America,
only whites and Asians have.
Acquired capability. Hopefully you know how this applies to Black people, because I talked to you about, if you're Black in America, you're likely to live in an impoverished environment, and impoverished environments have a lot of violence. Right, so you have a lot of Black youth exposed to pain, trauma, and violence who are acquiring this capability to self-injure that they may not have had, you know, in the past, in our community in the past that we didn't see. Violence is the #1 killer of children, as I mentioned earlier. 15 to 24 in the African American community was disproportionately represented. Many social scientists agree that racial segregation, racism, and social isolation, drug and alcohol abuse, and media violence all contribute significantly to aggressive and violent behavior. Many young men of color suffer from Black self-hatred, which has resulted from years of conditioning in their social environment. We talk about post-traumatic slavery syndrome, we talk about the Mahapa, and we talk about how ascribing and assimilating being culturally misoriented can lead to self-hatred of those in your community. So what are some solutions? You know, well, the solutions are simple, because we know that if burdensomeness and belongingness and acquired capability are the risk factors, we need to do things that increase belongingness among Black youth. We need to do things in our community that decrease burdensomeness, feelings of ineffectiveness. And we need to reduce the trauma, exposure to violence that our children are facing. So how do we do that? Well, in this book, I did some research on acculturation of psychopathology, looking at suicide and eating disorder behavior in the Black community. Because I was studying the theory that suicide behavior and eating disorder behavior are not traditionally found in the Black community. They are things that we see because we have assimilated or acculturated Western European values. And so now pathology that was prevalent in their community will start to grow in our community. So, you know, you see a lot of these school shooters, and people always say, oh, you know, school shooter, they know it's a white person. Well, don't be surprised if you start to see Black people doing these behaviors, because we assimilate and acculturate what the dominant society is doing. It's just a matter of time. That is, unless you become African-centered and you
become culturally oriented, right?
So
So in this book, I examined the connection between culture and psychopathology. I examined ethnic identification and cultural attitudes as being predictive of depression, anxiety, suicide, and eating disorder behavior, namely drive for fitness and body dissatisfaction. Right? So one of the main things I found was that African self-fortification, which is self-knowledge and self-affirmation related to African-centered values, customs, and institutions, having a consciousness about one's cultural heritage, attitudes, and beliefs about one's race, serve as coping mechanisms which buffer against many forms of psychological stress.
So this factor, African self-fortification, which was developed by Dr. Kobe Campbell and Yvonne Bell over at Florida A&M University, it's called the African self-consciousness scale. This sub-factor in that scale, African self-fortification, was significantly
related to mental well-being among Black students. In particular, for African American
college students, I found, I studied students at Florida State University and students at Florida A&M University. And we found that among Black college students, having high acculturated stress, so feeling stress of, we talk about, do I keep my values that my mom and dad taught me at home, my grandmother had, they told me get up, go to church on Sundays, things like that. Or do I leave all that stuff alone and do the secular thing or the mainstream popular thing that everyone around is doing? Right, that predicament that you're in, that stress you feel, is called the culture of stress. So basically, all of us who are Black and are integrated in society experience a culture of stress. Well, when you have a culture that stress is high and your African self-fortification is low, meaning you don't ascribe to any Black values or participate in your community, or
have a Black consciousness, those individuals had a higher rate of suicidality. For African American women, having high cultural stress and low African self-fortification
was related to greater body image dissatisfaction. So for Black women, we didn't really find a suicide connection because Black women tend to be protected against suicide. They're the least likely racial, ethnic, gender group to die by suicide. That doesn't mean that they don't die by suicide. They're just the least likely.
Right, so something about being a Black woman is protective against suicide.
But we found that the acculturation and psychopathology component for them was that if they have low African self-fortification undergoing a culture of stress, they're more likely to have greater body image dissatisfaction. We also found that individuals who had Black women who had a low value for African-centered relationships were more at risk for
body dissatisfaction and drive for fitness.
So what's low value African-centered relationships? And the way to describe it is if you're a Black woman and you have white female friends and Black female friends, but you value your white female friends more than your Black female friends, meaning you ascribe to their worldview and their beliefs, how they dress, how they look, their body image type, and that holds more weight to you or for you than what your Black female friends may be thinking or dressing or doing.
So individuals like that who had a low value for African-centered relationships had a high drive for fitness
and a high body image dissatisfaction. And
that's because they're striving to
white European standards of beauty and body image type.
So remember, we said having, othering yourself and being culturally misoriented is bad for your mental well-being if you're a Black person in America.
So how do we increase belongingness and increase our African self-fortification? Well,
connecting to other Africans or Black conscious individuals and groups in your community or throughout the diaspora is one way. You can do that through the internet. You could join organizations, participate in a Black church like the African Methodist Episcopal Church or other Black religious or spiritual groups that are African-centered, right? So you have
people talk about the Hebrew Israelites out there, they talk about the Nation of Islam out there,
or just the Black church itself. Okay, those are some groups participating in Black fraternal organizations or attending an HBCU or participating in a Black professional organization.
The one I participate in is the Association of Black Psychologists, ABPSI.
Connecting to Africans in the motherland. I mentioned to you, I went to Ghana with Dr. Noble and Dr. Akbar and this Nyanyam project for 2 weeks. And that was to connect students in America with Africans in Ghana. And joining an African-centered movement or group, right?
These are ways that you can fortify yourself in your community,
Feel like you belong and feel effective
by participating in your cultural group. There's some misunderstandings, so in our communities, if we have to address some of these misunderstandings that make us feel
ineffective and burdened, right? And that is that in the African American community, many people misunderstand what a mental health condition is. They don't talk about it.
They think they're being punished from God, and it's a personal weakness. There's some shame or stigma associated with it.
So people don't often talk about it, or when they do, they like to
go to their pastor or pray it out.
So one of the things that we do at Danager Solutions, we go into the
community, we go to churches, Black churches, and talk about mental health and provide ourselves as a resource. And help train pastors and preachers and reverends, deacons about how to identify when someone needs serious mental health treatment
and where to refer them to.
Your faith, spirituality, and community are important. Historically, faith, spirituality have been very important in the Black community. And so it should also continue to be when you talk about your mental health.
There's research that shows faith and spirituality can help in the recovery process. Spiritual practices can be a strong part of your treatment plan. When you
talk to your therapist, you should let them know if your religion or your faith is important to you.
Your spiritual faith community can provide support and help to reduce isolation, feeling like you don't belong. A primary care doctor is a great place to start.
So if you're undergoing any type of mental health issue or distress or think you might, the first place you want to go is to a primary care physician to make sure it's not a medical illness like a thyroid problem or some other chronic illness that can affect your mood like lupus.
Right, so you want to start there, and that doctor might be able to assess to determine if you actually have a mental health condition or a physical health condition that's manifesting as a emotional behavioral disorder.
When you select your therapist, make sure that they are culturally competent, right?
Ask them, have you treated other African Americans? Have you received training in cultural competence or on African American mental health? Remember, we don't want to be culturally misoriented.
We don't just want to assimilate, well, this is the treatment that works because those treatments have been, for the large part, developed on individuals, white Americans, right? And not on Black Americans, even though it's applied to us.
So you want to make sure that they are culturally competent. You want to see if their cultural background might influence how they communicate with you in treatment. And ask them how do they plan to integrate your beliefs and practices into treatment. And you should always
mention your beliefs, customs, and values.
And if that person's not interested in learning about your culture or making that part of treatment, then you should actually be referred out to someone who's culturally competent.
Right.
So this problem that we have of Black on Black violence and fighting distrust in our community. So here's the problem. The problem,
at least from my research, what I think is going on is you have
a individual that has a low racial self-esteem, so a low ethnic identification, right? And they have high individual self-esteem, right? That's the Americanism that we ascribe to and assimilate. That I'm an individual, I have individual rights.
In the Black community, we tended to be more communal.
But as we assimilate or acculturate more and more, we become more individualistic. So the solution, this low racial self-esteem and high individual self-esteem lead to Black on Black violence or infighting when there's conflict. Okay. So the solution is to increase African self-fortification and racial esteem through teaching Black culture and history from an African-centered perspective. So seeing ourselves as the victor or hero instead of from a Eurocentric perspective where we are typically painted as the victim or villain. This will lead to greater unity and positive communication between Blacks. So 6 options on how to implement. 1, you send your children to an African-centered school, after-school program, or Saturdays. Right? Teach them African history at home from individuals like John Henrik Clark, Ivan Van Sertima, Sheikh Anta Diop. You can talk about the scholarly works of Dr. Amos Wilson, Naeem Akbar, Kobe Cambone, right? To show our kids how to apply their historical perspective in a modern context. We can also practice traditional African religions or spiritual systems like the Yoruba do or the Orishas, right? You can get into learning about that part of our history. You can participate in rites of passage programs or African-centered fraternal or sacred societies. And learn the African language. You know, that's something else we can do to connect yourself and feel like you belong. Also, this is what I think is the most important. View the world and all its problems and possible solutions from your own group's vested interests.
So again, this is what I mean by being African-centered, right? So when we were listening to Dr. Joyner, I hope you all were thinking from an African-centered perspective on, okay, I hear what he's saying, but what does this look like in my community? Because again, typically, if we're gonna, you know, learn about Black mental health and problems and solutions to it, it's gonna come from people in our own community. Those are the most likely the people who are gonna study it. All right, and always remember that help is available. If you're feeling suicidal, you can call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, it's 1-800-273-TALK or 8255. They've now got a 3-digit number, you can just call on your phone, it's 988. And I would like to recommend, you could also call the Association of Black Psychologists or go to their website. They have a directory where they can help you find a Black psychologist in your area, someone who's culturally competent to treat you and understand your specific cultural value system. So their number is 301-449-3082. And I'd like to thank Ms. Baker for inviting me here today and TCC for allowing me to speak. And of course, Bethune-Cookman University and I'd like to thank the creator for our individual differences and collective strengths. So thank you all. If you have questions, I'll be glad to take any questions from here or in the chat. So.
I do have a question. And it kind of goes along with one of the last things you said about connecting what Dr. Joyner said to our perspective. So when we were watching the video, I was thinking about one of the first things he said is that oftentimes people have to make that connection that their death is worth more than their life. What do you think that looks like in the African American community most of the time?
Okay, so are you asking about so burdensome, right? Feeling ineffective, like people will be better off without you. So what might that look like in the Black community? The burdensome part?
Well, and I guess I was kind of asking, is it more that people in our community are thinking that people would just be better off without me here? Or would they get more something of value by me not being here?
Right. So I'll tell you a little anecdote story and maybe it answers both parts of the question. So, you know, in the Black community, you know, depends on how connected and ingrained you are to the Black community, you'll know these types of stories of someone who is on public assistance. And they're not married, and they have children, but they got a man that lives in the home with them. But when public services comes to that house to visit and do a walkthrough, that man in all his clothes is gonna go out into the car, and it's gonna look like there's no man that lives in that house. So this is feeling like a burden to others, that I'm weighing this woman down and I have to leave or she's gonna lose her assistance, which is helping us to survive. So you may feel like you're a burden, like you're ineffective, and like people will be better off without you. Because when we come around, there might be a penalty. So that's one way of how this may play out in our community. And so what I was saying about how do you overcome these feelings of being ineffective or burden to others, one is by having an African-centered worldview and value system that is different from the mainstream value system that is taught to us, right? And so if you value, if you have a structured value system where things like your faith or God and family are at the top of that value system, then you will start to feel more effective and valued because you understand you have a position in that home, whether it's as a breadwinner or not, that you have a position in that home as a father, provider, caretaker, etc. And so you feel valued, like you're effective, even if you're not contributing or may not be able to contribute financially. If you have a Western European value system, then you value yourself, your own beliefs, money, material things. And so you may think, if I don't have the money, if I'm not the breadwinner in this house, if I'm not, you know, bringing home the bacon, so to speak, I'm worthless. Why? Who's gonna want? Who's gonna listen to me? What is my role as a man or as a person in this society if I'm not generating wealth and money. Yes, question?
Not really a question, but a comment on the burden type of mindset. I think a lot of the times, at least in the youth, I'm somebody who's young. I hear a lot of my friends talk about this, but it's the burden of feeling, it's a financial thing. Like you go to college and you're leaving your parents and you're in their house trying to pay for the bills that, you know, you create with going to college and trying to experience your own things. But then you feel guilty. You feel like you're weighing something on your parents because you want to make something for yourself, but it's causing your parents to be in debt. It's causing your parents to go through more financial hardship that you saw them go through when you were a kid. You know, so things like that, that's like the biggest thing that I think of when I think of like burdensomeness. Like a lot of people go through that, just having to see your parents struggle through another set of debt that you want to do, you want to achieve it, but you're gonna have to do it or else you can't achieve. I don't know, it's always a big one that I think of.
Yep,
That's very true. And so,
you know, in the environment I work in at HBCU, oftentimes it's the grandparent that has taken on this financial burden to help pay for the student to go to school. And so, yes, the students feel a lot of pressure because they understand the amount of debt that's being incurred by the family. Good comment. Any other questions, comments? Or in the chat? Yes, ma'am.
I thought it was interesting when you mentioned the connection between Black women and the Bibles mafia.
Mhm.
So could you kind of go into that some more?
Sure. So, in the research that I did, I was looking at, like the title of the book, Acculturation of Psychopathology. So I'm from my theoretical background is from a perspective that, as Black Americans or individuals of African descent, historically you didn't see suicide or eating disorder behavior in our community. And we went through the Mahapa, right? The transatlantic slave trade, people were lynched and abused, but you didn't see that type of violence being manifested as suicide behavior in the Black community. But as we, you know, after integration, as we turn our children over to the larger society and educate them, part of your education is to assimilate the value system of the larger society. And so as we assimilate those values, whatever they may be, like I mentioned earlier, the individualism, the materialism, right? And you try to compete in this society, that's how you judge yourself. That can cause some psychological distress, right? And so when I looked at Black women, because I gave a myriad of measures on depression, anxiety, suicide, and eating disorder behavior. When I looked at Black women, and I measured their ethnic identification, how strongly they identify with being Black, and then I looked at specific ethnic identity measures that were found in the African subconscious scale. What we found is that Black women, they weren't significantly at risk for suicide. Their factor that was related to culture had to do with body image dissatisfaction, which is a component of having an eating disorder. So you have drive for thinness and body image dissatisfaction, which were the two factors that became correlated with having a low African self-fortification or low ethnic identification for Black women who experience culture distress. So Black women who are integrating into society, right? Those were the ones who, if they didn't have a high value for their Black relationships, they couldn't put emphasis on their Black friendships and relationships. If they didn't participate in their community, they didn't go to a Black church, they didn't belong to a Black sorority, they didn't participate in any group that was culturally oriented to their Blackness. Those people were at risk for having a drive for thinness where they would restrict their eating, right, so that they could lose weight, or they would have body image dissatisfaction, right, which is when they would look in the mirror, they would never like what they see, they always think that they're overweight or that they're unattractive. And when you look into the literature on that, it talks about how because they're not being protected, I would say, by your culture. So your culture is something that develops naturally to help you adapt and survive in the environment. And so when they don't have these cultural protections of being in the Black community, And they're ascribing to Western European values and standards of beauty, and they don't see anyone that looks like them as being beautiful. They see all these women in magazines with blonde hair and blue eyes, and that's the standard of beauty, and their body shape and type is much smaller than the average Black American woman. These women started to have the self-hate, right? They don't like how they look. It doesn't, they start to get depressed, and they start to get anxious, and they do things to change or alter their appearance. So one way to improve that, again, is to insulate yourself in the Black community and to learn what Black cultural values are and try to practice or strive to those, which I listed as faith, family, as being two of the top values. And materialism would be very low in the Black value system.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good question.
I have another
We'll go to our elder first. Yes, ma'am. No, okay. All right, take a shot. Hey.
what do you think would be steps to help students at community colleges who may not have as many opportunities for clubs and engagement?
Right, so what we do for students at a community college, at a predominantly white institution who may not have access to these Black cultural groups and organizations. Well, I'll tell you what I did. You know, I got all my degrees from Florida State, so I've been up here for a minute. And I used to take myself across the tracks to Florida A&M University and make relationships. I made relationships with the Black psychology program over there, and I would go to their AD student circle meetings. I would go to their research conferences, and they were very warm, and they welcomed me in, and I just made sure to participate over there. And then from that, I got exposed to different groups to participate in. So what I would say is, if there's an HBCU in your community, you should try to reach out and make connections to people at that HBCU. If there are not any HBCUs in your community, like I said, you can look for a Black church to participate in. If you can't find that, there are many groups online that you could, virtually participate in to get that need to belong there, because that's a fundamental human need. You have to feel like you belong, you have to feel affected in order to be mentally well.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Come on,
Any other questions, comments, or in the chat? Anything in the chat?
I asked if anyone had anything in the chat,
Okay.
nothing yet.
Okay.
But I was let me comment on one thing, the question she just asked.
Yeah.
I went to the University of Florida. And one of the things that question that you think about is, I was part of the gospel choir. And we had students from Santa Fe Community College who would engage with, they were part of the choir as well. So to me, that kind of fits into that, coming from there, even though we were, of course, a PWI, but that particular organization, of course, was predominantly Black. But they would we always had plenty of Santa Fe students who would come over and participate in that organization.
One good thing about PWI, it's going to be very well funded. There are a lot of opportunities. So you could do a study abroad program at the University of Ghana if you want to. I talk about making connections to Africans in the diaspora, or you can go to South America, to Brazil, getting, because that has like the highest population of Black people outside of the continent of Africa. So there are ways that are creative that you could take advantage of if you find yourself in an environment or institution that isn't an optimal environment for your own racial ethnic well-being. Yes, ma'am.
This is more of a comment. I was recently hearing former First Lady Michelle Obama was speaking about how as First Lady, she couldn't wear natural hair. And so, just thinking in terms of this is Black people, and, how we feel about how we look, our society treats us, something as simple as not being able to go into the world with your hair, is this professional, or is this not professional? And it's just interesting to me that someone with the accolades of Michelle Obama has to experience these same types of things that we all are going through, and she's been talking about.
Yeah, and a lot of these things are self-imposed. We think we can't go to work with our hair and locks, but who said we can't? We are self-censored. There's a lot of that going on today. Self-censoring, but we've been self-censoring as Black people to survive, right? To be adapted. We felt we had to straighten our hair or dressing certain attire. And that's fine because what matters is what's in your mind, you know, not necessarily on the outside. But yeah, so that's very interesting that, you know, she felt that way because that's self-imposed.
Yeah.
She could have worn her hair natural if she wanted to. She was the
But
first
she
lady.
didn't want to push it to her kids in general, the people that were gonna be, gonna take up the hit, they were not.
But they just kind of perpetuate this fear of your own Blackness. Because people will look at Michelle Obama and they say, oh, well, she's got her hair permed, so I need to do that too. She's now an icon and a role model. So just imagine if she walked out with, you know, an afro or locks, you know, simply locks or something. People would be like, oh, then young women would say, I can do that too. I don't have to straighten my hair or wear a weave or whatever, you know, I can just leave my hair natural. No one told me that it was okay for me to lock my hair. I told myself it was okay. And I went to work at Florida State Hospital. That's another place I used to work for like 12 years out there. The largest forensic hospital in the state of Florida. And I just twisted my hair and they got right to work. Nobody said anything. Nobody said anything. But a lot of times we self-censor thinking that we can't do things that we are free to do. You know, a lot of that is social learning. You know, you want to fit in, don't stick out, you know, keep your head down, don't look in the eye. These are all things that we learned over the years that were adapted, that we no longer need to practice. Yes.
I remember when my brother's in corporate America, he works at Coca-Cola. He's about to catch up with you right now. But when he first locked his hair, I was like, what are you doing? You work for Coca-Cola.
Right.
That's not gonna work, but yeah. And that self-imposed idea of what we're supposed to be, I had to get over that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very important. Your self-expression, that's a form of freedom of speech.
Yeah.
You know, how you wear your hair is your
This student, about 3 weeks ago, she came upstairs to, she was doing something. And she stopped, I said, why did you like your hair? I said, oh, I have a little, not mine, but, I'm the daughter, I'm there, you know. I said, come with me, so the dean, our dean, will be farming. I said, that's the thing, the department, I said, you got to announce this, should have.
That's correct.
Right, so you know, someone's always watching
you know, especially in a university environment, college environment, someone's always watching. So what you do has significance, even if they don't pay attention. So I deliberately came here with my hair out instead of go back. I deliberately wore an African tie, you know, because I know those things matter. Because someone might be watching and give them that little bit of courage to go do what they want to be self-expressive, which to practice their culture. And that's the act of self-fortification. I'm talking about strengthening yourself in your belief in your cultural perspective and background, your worldview. And that your worldview as a Black person has just as much weight as some other cultures' worldview. And they're going to do things in their best interest, but you should do things in your best interest. You hear the United States always talk about its interests in the world and abroad. And if we have no interest there, then they're not really concerned. That's kind of how we should be. What is our interest? How does this apply to me? That's all I have.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna take it back a little bit. You said that Black women are like the least likely group to commit suicide. To die by suicide.
Yes.
I guess that changes my question. I mean, my comment really.
That doesn't mean they don't die by suicide. It said if you look at race, ethnicity, and gender, Black women are the least likely groups to die by suicide.
So that doesn't mean attempts. That doesn't include attempts.
No, so, yeah, right, so attempts are different.
Because you could attempt suicide and not die, right? So we're talking, we study the most serious suicidal behavior, or lethal suicidal behavior, which are people who actually have died by suicide, and look at ways to protect them against it. And so Black women can die, and do die by suicide. But again, we're just talking stats, that they're gonna be, if you're a Black woman and they, die by suicide, or if it's the Black woman and, you're thinking about someone who's dying by suicide, then they will probably be the least likely suspect, that you would look at for someone who's dying by suicide. And that's statistically, so that's mean for the group, not for the individual, their individual differences. So just because I know that for a group doesn't mean I can look at a Black woman and say she's not at risk of suicide. You have to look at her as an individual. But when we look at the collective group, Black women as a collective are least likely to die by suicide.
Right, and then you mentioned that there was some type of protective factor, like we're protected against it somehow. But then that took me back to like the three, like the Venn diagram.
Yes, the burdensomeness, belongingness, and acquired capability.
Right. And I thought like maybe we're missing, because under like being a burden, there were like the wording that like your death would be worth more.
Yes, burdensomeness, when you feel like your death will be worth more to the people around you than your life.
And I think that we don't really feel like that because we have to do so much in the community. So I think that that's missing right there. I feel like our life is worth more than our death in any event. Like even if we're like, oh, I'm so tired, like I'm ready to give up. Like, but like other people depend on us so much.
Correct.
It's like that's
what I was gonna say, that other people depend on you. So Black women
tend to, be the mothers in society and in the Black community. And so
women who have children, that's a protective factor against suicide. So having someone who's dependent upon you or looking for you for support, that's gonna make you feel like you belong, and it's gonna make you feel like you're effective, because you're a caretaker. So that could be one of the reasons why they have a low suicide rate.
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to hear your thoughts on, how the courts are trying to monitor what professors are able to speak upon as far as indoctrinating people.
Sure, that's nothing new.
We've always been censored in this country, not been able to speak and teach certain things. So,
I don't really worry about that.
So I do some training sometimes on critical race theory. We did one in Orlando at a global ERG conference, which is this big corporate America conference for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we talked about critical race theory. We talked about the governor and his attempts to censor people from talking about the history of systemic racism in the country. But the oppressor class, everyone should talk about those things. That's not new. So to me, it's like background noise. If you focus on it, it becomes something scary. But if you just say, this is old news, they've always tried to censor us from waking up or being woke, stop woke act. So I say this, when I hear about the stop woke act, I think about Ron DeSantis being the one who would tell Jesus not to wake Lazarus up. Which is weird. I was weird, but that's what he's doing. Like, don't wake up, stay asleep. You want people to stay asleep so you can control them. So I don't really worry about that. It also reminds me of this idea. So when I was in graduate school, people, wouldn't talk about race-related issues because I just want to get my degree. I don't want to, I'm trying to get my doctorate. I'm not trying to rock a boat. I'm cut my hair off. I'm, wear a suit and tie. I'm not going to raise any questions about race or ethnicity or discrimination. Then after, grad school, I'm like, when are you going to say something? Well, I'm on internship now. I don't want to mess up my internship, but I got a good internship to get my doctorate. After internship, are you gonna speak and say something now? Are you gonna speak out for your community? Are you gonna, step out front? Oh, no, I got this job in corporate America or whatever. And I just got this job now, so I'm not gonna say anything now. So they're never gonna say anything there. You just have to take the opportunity to speak and be heard. So, I've kind of always been like, I've always been speaking about these types of issues, so to me, it's kind of natural. But fear is your own enemy. Like a lot of times we self-censor and stuff because we're afraid and there's nothing to fear but fear itself. No one's ever, I've never been punished or no one's ever tried to attack me or come at me or anything like that. But you can have those fears that might be out there. I haven't seen it. I'm not saying that it's not out there, but I haven't experienced it. And if we step out there, maybe others may feel like they don't experience it either. It's like a boogeyman. Yep. There's a question.
I will mention, there was one comment in here, I think it went back to Iris's question about Michelle Obama. But Camille said, this conversation just made me think of the Hair Act or the Crown Act. And the fact that an act needs to be created and still being signed in 2022 to protect against hair discrimination.
Right, that's because we've given our authority and powers to somebody else to rule, to say that you need a law passed because you feel comfortable and confident to wear your hair out in the way that it grows from your head. Which is very interesting to step back and look at. They have to legislate your blackness, your ability to just be a natural person. Yes.
Comments? I think that it may be possible that Black women are more susceptible to being afraid of rocking the boat or speaking out or advocating on top of the parenting roles and those other areas that use that. And so what do you think? Do you think that may be a difference between Black men and women, between our perception of how others perceive our Black?
So the question is, you said that Black women tend to be more concerned about going against the social norms of the larger society. And so what I would say, I would agree to that, and as opposed to Black men, and I would say that's because Black women are one of the most educated groups in America, right? What is education? It's an acculturation process. So Black women, I would say, therefore, are also one of the most acculturated minority members in America. There are also a lot of social programs for Black women. You can get public assistance, if you have children, you get those other things. There's a lot of grants and scholarships now, that's why you're able to go to college and get all these degrees. But where are the social programs for Black men? It's a prison, that's not a social program. Where are the community centers? Where are the right advocates? Where are the mentorship programs? Where is the funding to support Black men going to college? So society not only doesn't have these social programs for Black men, society is actually actively against Black men. If you look at the mass incarceration and the images portrayed of Black men in the media. So I think that has a lot to do with it as well. So yes, Black men tend to be more acculturated and therefore more vested or invested in the perpetuation of white American society. And that's something we probably have to look at as a cultural group. So where are we going with this? They also talk about politics. You see, like Black women are diehard liberal Democratic voting members, and then they talk about Black men are not loyal to the Democratic Party, and they may vote, they're more likely to vote something else compared to the Black women. And so I think all those things are factors in that. You also see a lot of Black women in positions of power and authority. You probably have more Black female professors than you do Black male professors that you see. You probably see more Black females in your classes than Black males as well. So where are we?
That is so true. I'm getting my degree at FSU right now in criminology. And for the 1.5 years that I've been at FSU,
Mhm.
is my master's program. I've not one black male in any of my classes.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So you don't see us as educators, as decision makers and leaders in the community. So where are, what are we doing? Where are we being relegated to? This is why we may feel like a burden or ineffective, or that society has rejected Black women. So what do you do with that? You try to create a community and a space for yourself. You fortify yourself. You find what you do to contribute to your community. If you're not contributing to the community, you need to get active. These things are gonna fortify you when you deal with the system of racism and white supremacy. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. I was gonna ask you, is there any other like examples or like big ideas when it comes to generational like trauma in the Black community? Because I feel like that's such an interesting topic and such a vast and huge topic when it comes to how we work as people. And I don't know, I just want to hear maybe more examples or maybe more of what you've seen, at least in your side of your community, or things of that sort about generational trauma.
Right, so I refer you back to Dr. Joy, the group book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. If you don't have it, you should get it. There are also videos you can watch. He has a lot of videos on YouTube, but it'd be better to get the book because it just has a wealth of information and examples that you can go through. But someone else I would refer you to would be the work of Dr. Kobe Cambone. He's from Florida A&M University. He's gone on to be with the ancestors, as we say. But he developed this idea called cultural misorientation. He also has a book on the African self-consciousness. Okay, and so if you study, what Dr. Jordan Drew's talking about and Dr. Cambone's talking about, you'll see how if we are assimilated or if we're oriented to the dominant society's worldview and understanding of how things should be right and wrong, right? That is going to be, again, in this society that was founded on racism, on the subjugation of Black people. And if you ascribe to that value system that grew out of that type of a country, and you're Black, that's going to be probably to your detriment. You're going to start to ascribe beliefs and teach those beliefs and values to your kids that aren't to their benefit. So one thing that we talk about with my students at Cookman, we were talking recently about spanking, disciplining children. But where does that come from? So, you talk about don't spank, all the Black kids are going to jump up. Well, I was spanked and I'm fine, not to mention all the trauma stuff we just talked about. I was spanked and I'm fine, right? Even though adults will say, oh, yeah, that was done to me, I was fine. But then you have to ask, just like the story about the pot roast, where did that come from? Well, I was spanked because my mother spanked me. Who spanked your mother? Or her mother? Who spanked her mother? Well, great grandmother did. Who spanked them? Who spanked great grandmother? The white slave master spanked her. Oh. So when we were in Africa, were we spanking our kids and hitting them with stuff? I don't recall any record of that in the work that I've done as a way to discipline. So we say that it's fine, but it comes from something that has been passed down over the years that we don't look at critically. And we just perpetuate it and we think that it's okay. Like I can keep eating these chitlins and hog moss and ham hocks and all that, and I can still be healthy. That's not gonna happen. You're gonna get sick. Right, so you gotta learn to change your diet. So you have to also learn to change certain behaviors that are maladaptive. So why was the mom beating the children back in the slave master's time? Because she didn't want the slave master to beat the child because he would kill the child. So she would beat the child herself to condition his behavior to be obedient. And that's what we still do today. So that's another example.
We also use the Bible in that sense too.
Spare the rod and spoil the child. That's what they beat Black people. And so when you look at the dynamics between Black and white culture in this society, the white society is the paternalistic figure. They make all the rules,
They distribute all the punishment. And we are the children in the society. We don't make any rules. We don't divvy out any discipline to anybody. We don't own any ships or ports and do trade with other people. You know, we don't own farms like we used to and provide food to our communities. Everything we get comes from somebody else. That's a dependent group of people or a child to someone who's more,
who is the provider,
which would be like the parent. Very good questions. Even though it's a small group, you guys got some good questions.
I want to thank you for so nicely putting that information about how spanking is tied to this post-traumatic slave syndrome, because that's something that I've had to try to talk to family members about. I don't spank my kid for it disturbing, but I don't know what that is. So now I have some research to kind of
The American Pediatric Society states that if you hit your child with an object, that's abuse. So if you hit them with a belt, a shoe, whatever, any object other than your open hand, then that's considered abuse. If you leave a welt or a mark on your child, that's abuse. So don't raise your hand, but just think about if you've ever had a welt on you or been hit with a belt or something, you know. And so this is not to judge, you know, our parents and where we come from. This is to understand it and look at it critically instead of just perpetuating it and passing it down for generation upon generation, not knowing where it came from, thinking that it is part of our culture, and it's not our culture. It's an adaptive culture or an assimilated culture that we have. All right.
Thank you.
And just some thank yous and awesome jobs in the comments as well.
Appreciate it.
All right. And thank all of you for coming. I appreciate it. I hope you got something out of this. Awesome.
Guess we'll sign off.
Yes. It's great information, discussion, topic. Much magnificence, Dr. Daniel, and all right, awesome. I'm gonna stop the recording.